Looking past the lens and venturing across borders, we capture the enduring essence of human resilience. Join us on a professional journey to witness the monumental events that changed the world forever.
It's been 15 minutes. My license is valid, my registration is current, everything is legal. How much longer is this going to take?
As long as it takes. Get back to your car.
I'm going to miss my flight. Can you please just write the ticket so I can leave?
I said get back to your vehicle. I'm still conducting my investigation.
What? I was going 7 miles over the speed limit with traffic.
Southbound toward Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport carried thousands of travelers daily, most of them in a hurry to catch flights, and most of them driving slightly above the posted speed limit in the rush to reach their gates on time. But Officer Derek Holloway didn't pull over the white drivers in BMW sedans or the Asian drivers in Mercedes SUVs who were going the same speed. He pulled over Dr. Elena Baptiste in her silver Lexus because she was a young black woman in an expensive car, and his 6 years of racially biased traffic enforcement had taught him to see that combination as inherently suspicious. What should have been a quick stop for a minor speeding violation turned into a 43-minute detention on the highway shoulder, while Holloway asked increasingly invasive and baseless questions about her citizenship, her vehicle ownership, her clothing, and whether she was transporting drugs, all while checking his watch and deliberately stalling, because he could see she was desperate to leave, and her desperation fed his assumption that she must be guilty of something. What he didn't know was that her urgency came from wanting to catch a flight to spend the summer with her uncle, who had stage 4 cancer and limited time left. That her uncle was Lawrence Baptiste, whose reputation for winning massive civil rights settlements against police departments made even experienced officers nervous. And that this traffic stop's timeline, body cam footage, and complete lack of legitimate justification would become the evidence that cost Holloway everything he'd built over 6 years of getting away with targeting black women drivers on the airport route. Before we go further, what city or country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We love seeing where you're tuning in from. If you believe that getting to the airport on time shouldn't depend on the color of your skin, then hit the like and subscribe button here on JPTV. Dr. Elena Baptiste checked the time on her dashboard as she merged onto Interstate 85 South from the connector near downtown Atlanta. It was 2:47 p.m. and her flight to Chicago O'Hare was scheduled to depart at 4:35 p.m. from Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. She had about 12 miles to cover, and then the process of parking, getting through security, and reaching her gate. She was cutting it closer than she liked, but she'd make it if traffic cooperated and nothing went wrong. She was 31 years old, a biomedical engineer working for a medical device company in Atlanta's growing tech corridor. She'd graduated from Georgia Tech with her PhD 3 years ago and had been working on innovative cardiac monitoring systems that had already saved lives and earned her company recognition in the industry. She was dressed professionally because she'd come straight from a morning meeting with investors, wearing a tailored navy blazer, cream blouse, and dark jeans with heels. Her natural hair was styled in a neat twist-out, and she wore minimal jewelry except for small gold earrings and a watch. Her silver 2023 Lexus ES350 was registered and insured in her name, purchased new last year after a promotion that came with a significant salary increase. The backseat held her rolling suitcase and a carry-on bag packed for a month-long stay in Chicago. She'd taken a leave of absence from work, the first extended time off she'd taken since starting her career, and she was doing it for a reason that made her chest tight every time she thought about it. Her uncle Lawrence was dying. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, diagnosed 4 months ago, prognosis measured in months rather than years. He was 62 years old, her father's older brother, and the man who'd helped raise her after her father died when she was 12. He'd paid for her SAT prep courses, helped her apply to colleges, attended her graduation ceremonies, celebrated every professional achievement. He was a civil rights attorney based in Chicago, one of the most successful in the country, known for taking on police misconduct cases and winning multi-million-dollar settlements that forced departments to change their practices. Lawrence had called her 2 weeks ago and asked if she could spend the summer with him. He wanted time with family while he still felt well enough to enjoy it, wanted to share stories and memories before the disease took that ability away from him. Elena had immediately requested the leave from work, booked her flight, and spent the past week preparing to be away for a month. Today's flight was just the beginning of what might be her last summer with the uncle who'd been more like a father to her. She was doing 72 miles per hour in the left lane, matching the flow of traffic around her. The speed limit was 65, but everyone on I-85 during afternoon hours drove between 70 and 75, and the police rarely bothered with stops unless someone was going significantly faster or driving recklessly. Elena stayed in her lane, used her signals, and focused on getting to the airport safely and on time. Officer Derek Holloway sat in his patrol car on the shoulder of I-85 South near the old National Highway exit, running radar on the southbound traffic heading toward the airport. He was 38 years old, a 6-year veteran of the Georgia State Patrol assigned to the airport corridor. His beat covered the stretch of highway where travelers rushed to catch flights, and he'd made thousands of traffic stops over his career, pulling over speeders and reckless drivers who posed actual safety threats. But Holloway had also developed a pattern over those 6 years, a pattern that 9 complaints in his personnel file documented, but that his supervisors had never addressed seriously enough to change his behavior. He pulled over black drivers at rates far exceeding their percentage of traffic on I-85. He pulled over black women in nice cars more frequently than any other demographic. He asked invasive questions about citizenship and vehicle ownership to people whose appearance triggered his bias. He prolonged stops beyond what was necessary for the stated violation, fishing for additional charges or just exercising power over people he viewed as not belonging in the vehicles they drove. When Elena's silver Lexus passed his position, doing 72 and a 65, Holloway's radar registered the speed. Dozens of other vehicles were going the same speed or faster, including a white man in a BMW doing 75 and an Asian woman in a Mercedes SUV doing 73. Holloway could have pulled over any of them. He chose Elena. He pulled out into traffic and hit his lights, and Elena saw the blue flashing in her rearview mirror and felt her stomach drop. She checked her speed. She'd been going with traffic, not excessively fast, but she signaled and moved to the right shoulder anyway, pulling over near mile marker 73, about 8 miles from the airport. She put the car in park, turned off the engine, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they'd be visible. She'd been a black woman in America for 31 years, and she knew the rules for surviving traffic stops. Hands visible, no sudden movements, comply with requests, stay calm no matter how unfair the situation felt. Holloway approached her window with his hand resting on his weapon, his body camera activated and recording. He looked at her through the driver's side window, and his brain processed what he saw through the lens of 6 years of bias. Young black woman, expensive car, business clothes, heading toward the airport. In his mind, none of those things fit together naturally, which meant something was worth investigating. License and registration, he said when she rolled down her window. No greeting, no explanation of why he'd stopped her, just a demand. Elena reached slowly for her purse. Officer, can you tell me why you pulled me over? License and registration first, then we'll talk about it. She handed him her driver's license showing her Atlanta address and her vehicle registration showing the Lexus was registered to Elena Baptiste at the same address. Everything was current, legal, and matched perfectly. Holloway looked at the documents, then at her, then at the back seat where her luggage was visible. Where are you heading? I'm on my way to the airport. I have a flight at 4:35 and I'm running a bit late. So if this could be quick, I'd really appreciate it. You were doing 72 in a 65 zone. That's 7 over the speed limit. I was going with the flow of traffic, officer. Everyone around me was doing the same speed. I pulled you over, not everyone else. He looked at her clothes and at her hair, at the Lexus logo on her steering wheel. This your car? Yes, it's registered in my name. You have the registration right there. How long have you owned it? Elena felt the wrongness of the question immediately. About a year. Why does that matter for a speeding ticket? Just trying to get the full picture. What do you do for work that you can afford a car like this? The question was invasive and irrelevant, and Elena's professional training told her she didn't have to answer. But her survival instincts told her that refusing might escalate the situation. I'm a biomedical engineer. I work in medical device development. Holloway's expression suggested he didn't believe her, like the combination of her appearance and her profession didn't compute in his bias-shaped worldview. Where are you flying to? Chicago. Officer, I really need to get going. My flight board's in about 90 minutes, and I still need to park and get through security. Can we handle this quickly? You seem pretty nervous. Why are you so anxious to leave? Because I have a plane to catch and I can't miss it. I'm visiting family and the timing is important. What family? My uncle. He's sick and I'm spending the summer with him. Holloway wrote something in his notebook. Are you a U.S. citizen? Elena stared at him, the question so absurd and obviously racially motivated that she almost couldn't process it. What does my citizenship have to do with a speeding violation? Answer the question, ma'am. Yes, I'm a U.S. citizen. I was born in Atlanta. I've lived in Georgia my entire life. Do you have proof of citizenship with you? I have my driver's license and my passport in my carry-on bag, but I shouldn't need to prove my citizenship during a traffic stop. That's not legal. Holloway's face hardened at her assertion of rights. I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle. Elena checked the time on her dashboard. 2:54 p.m. 7 minutes had already passed and she was still 8 miles from the airport. Why do I need to step out for a speeding ticket? Ma'am, step out of the vehicle now. I'm not asking again. She got out slowly, her heart pounding, and Holloway positioned her at the back of her car, where the traffic rushing past on I-85 created a constant roar and wind that whipped at her blazer. Other drivers slowed down to look as they passed, some recording on their phones because a black woman being detained on the highway shoulder was becoming an unfortunately common image. Why are you dressed like that? Holloway asked, gesturing at her professional clothes. I came from a work meeting. Why does my clothing matter? Just seems fancy for someone heading to the airport. Makes me wonder if you're trying to look like something you're not. The implication was clear and infuriating. He was suggesting her professional appearance was a costume, that she was pretending to be someone she wasn't, that everything about her, her car, her clothes, her job, must be fraudulent because his bias couldn't accept that a young black woman could legitimately possess these things. I'm exactly who I say I am, Elena said, keeping her voice steady despite her rising anger. I'm a biomedical engineer with a PhD from Georgia Tech. I own this car. I'm heading to the airport to see my dying uncle, and you're making me miss my flight for no legitimate reason. Holloway pulled out his radio. I need to run a more thorough check on this vehicle and driver. Might be a few minutes. Elena looked at the time on her phone. 2:58 p.m. Her flight boarded in 97 minutes. She was still 8 miles from the airport, and this officer had just made it clear he had no intention of letting her go quickly. Holloway walked back to his patrol car with Elena's license and registration, and she stood at the back of her Lexus, watching the minutes tick away on her phone. Traffic roared past on I-85, and the afternoon sun beat down on the asphalt, making the air shimmer with heat. She checked the time every 30 seconds, watching her window to make the flight shrink with each passing minute. At 3:12 p.m., 14 minutes after he'd walked away, Holloway was still sitting in his car running checks that should have taken 3 minutes maximum. Elena could see him through his windshield, typing slowly on his computer, talking on his radio, deliberately taking his time. Her flight boarded at 4:05 p.m. and it was now impossible to make it, even if he let her go right this second. She walked toward his patrol car, staying calm but needing answers. Holloway got out and held up his hand. Ma'am, get back to your vehicle. Officer, it's been 15 minutes. My license is valid. My registration is current. Everything is legal. How much longer is this going to take? As long as it takes. Get back to your car. I'm going to miss my flight. Can you please just write the ticket so I can leave? I said get back to your vehicle. I'm still conducting my investigation. Investigation of what? I was going 7 miles over the speed limit with the flow of traffic. That's a simple ticket, not an investigation. Holloway stepped closer, using his size and position to intimidate her. I need to make sure this vehicle isn't stolen and that you're not transporting anything illegal. Your nervousness and resistance are giving me reasonable suspicion to extend this stop. I'm not nervous about anything illegal. I'm anxious because you're deliberately making me miss my flight to see my dying uncle. If you have nothing to hide, you shouldn't mind waiting while I verify everything. At 3:18 p.m., Holloway finally came back with her documents. The registration checks out, but I need to ask you some additional questions. Why are you really going to Chicago? I already told you I'm visiting my uncle who has cancer. And you're planning to stay for how long? A month. I took a leave of absence from work. A month is a long time. What are you really planning to do there? The question was absurd, and Elena's patience was breaking. I'm planning to spend time with my uncle before he dies. That's what people do when their family members are terminally ill. I'm going to need to search your vehicle for contraband. No, you don't have probable cause to search my car. I was going 7 miles over the speed limit. That doesn't give you the right to search anything. Holloway's expression hardened because he wasn't used to people asserting their rights, especially not black women who he expected to be compliant and intimidated. Your refusal to consent to a search is suspicious. That gives me additional reasonable suspicion. Exercising my constitutional rights isn't suspicious. It's legal, and you know you don't have grounds for this search. Are you transporting drugs or weapons to Chicago? No, I'm transporting clothes and books and personal items for a month-long visit with family. Then you shouldn't mind if I verify that. I do mind because it's an illegal search and you're doing this to make me miss my flight. I can see what you're doing. At 3:27 p.m., Elena made a decision. She'd already missed her flight's boarding time. The plane would leave without her, regardless of what happened in the next hour. This stop had gone from a minor inconvenience to an obvious case of racial profiling and illegal detention. And she wasn't going to stand on a highway shoulder any longer being harassed. Officer, I'm leaving. You can mail me the speeding ticket. She started walking toward her driver's side door, and Holloway moved fast, grabbing her arm. You're not going anywhere. You're being detained. For what? Speeding 7 miles over? You can't detain me for that after half an hour. You're being detained for refusing to cooperate with my investigation. There is no investigation. This is harassment. She pulled her arm away from his grip, not violently but firmly, asserting her right to not be touched. That movement, that refusal to be physically controlled, triggered Holloway's aggression. He grabbed both her arms and spun her around, forcing her against the side of her Lexus. You're under arrest for obstruction. I'm not obstructing anything. I'm trying to leave an illegal detention. Holloway pulled out his handcuffs and forced her arms behind her back. Elena didn't physically resist, but she kept talking, kept asserting that this was wrong, that he had no legal grounds for arrest. The handcuffs went on too tight, cutting into her wrists. A truck driver named Elijah, who'd pulled over 50 yards ahead because he'd been watching the stop unfold, started recording on his phone, capturing Holloway, forcing Elena to the ground on her knees beside the highway. Her blazer was dusty, her professional appearance destroyed, her dignity violated in front of hundreds of passing drivers. My flight leaves at 4:35, Elena said, her voice breaking now with anger and grief. My uncle is dying, and you're making me miss the time I have left with him. For what? For driving the same speed as everyone else? For being black in a nice car? Holloway called for a transport vehicle to take her to the station. At 3:41 p.m., 54 minutes after the initial stop, Elena was in handcuffs on the side of Interstate 85 while her flight to Chicago boarded without her, and the summer she was supposed to spend with her Uncle Lawrence slipped away because an officer couldn't see past his bias long enough to write a simple speeding ticket. Elena sat in handcuffs in a holding cell at the Georgia State Patrol Station off Sylvan Road for 3 hours before she was allowed to make her phone call. Her flight had departed at 4:37 p.m., 2 minutes late, and she'd watched the time pass on the clock in the cell, knowing she was missing it. When they finally brought her to a phone at 6:52 p.m., her hands were shaking as she dialed her uncle's number. Lawrence Baptiste answered on the second ring. Elena, your flight landed an hour ago. Where are you? Uncle Lawrence, I'm at a police station. I got arrested. Her voice broke. I'm so sorry. I tried to make the flight, but the officer wouldn't let me go. There was a long pause, and when Lawrence spoke again, his voice had shifted from concerned family member to the attorney who'd spent 30 years destroying police departments in court. Tell me everything, slowly and precisely. She told him about the stop, the invasive questions, the deliberate delays, the refusal to let her leave, the arrest for obstruction, when she tried to get back in her car. Lawrence listened without interrupting, and she could hear him typing notes as she talked. "Elena, I need you to not say anything else to anyone there. Don't answer questions, don't sign anything, don't make any statements. I'm calling a colleague in Atlanta right now, and they'll have you out within 2 hours. Then I'm flying to Atlanta tonight. Uncle Lawrence, you shouldn't travel. You need a rest. They arrested my niece and made her miss her flight to see me. I'm coming to Atlanta, and I'm going to personally handle this case." Within 90 minutes, an attorney from a firm Lawrence had partnered with on previous cases arrived at the station and secured Elena's release. The charges were dropped almost immediately once the department realized who they'd arrested and who her family was. But the damage was done. Her flight was gone, her summer plans disrupted, and precious time with her dying uncle had been stolen. Lawrence Baptiste arrived in Atlanta the next morning, looking frailer than Elena had seen him in the photos he'd been sending. But his mind was sharp and his anger was focused. He requested all documentation of the traffic stop within hours of landing, and what he found was a prosecutor's dream case against an officer with an indefensible pattern. Holloway's body cam footage showed everything. The stop started at 2:47 p.m. for going 72 in a 65. Holloway ran her license at 2:54 p.m., and the results came back clean within 2 minutes. Yet he sat in his car until 3:12 p.m. doing nothing. The audio captured his questions about citizenship, vehicle ownership, and her clothing, none of which had any relation to a speeding violation. The video showed Elena repeatedly explaining she had a flight to catch, and it showed Holloway checking his watch and smiling slightly, like her desperation entertained him. The arrest itself was captured clearly. Elena calmly stating she was leaving, Holloway grabbing her, forcing her down, handcuffing her while she verbally asserted this was illegal, but never physically resisted. The charge of obstruction had no basis because she'd complied with every lawful order and only attempted to leave after being illegally detained for 43 minutes. Then Lawrence pulled Holloway's personnel file and found the pattern he'd expected. 9 complaints over 6 years, 7 of them from black women drivers, all describing the same experience Elena had. Prolonged stops, invasive questions about citizenship and vehicle ownership, searches without probable cause, threats of arrest for asserting rights. One complaint from 8 months earlier was nearly identical. A black woman heading to the airport, pulled over for minor speeding, detained for 38 minutes, missed her flight. Every complaint had been investigated internally and dismissed. Supervisors had noted Holloway's pattern, but taken no meaningful disciplinary action. The department had allowed him to continue targeting black women drivers on the airport route for 6 years, despite documented evidence of racial profiling. Lawrence filed a federal lawsuit within a week, but he also did something the department hadn't anticipated. He held a press conference outside the Georgia State Patrol headquarters with Elena beside him, and he didn't just talk about her case. He brought 3 other women who'd filed complaints against Holloway, women whose complaints had been dismissed and forgotten. Each one told similar stories of being stopped near the airport, questioned about citizenship and vehicle ownership, detained until they missed flights or important appointments. The media coverage was immediate and brutal. Video of Elena's arrest spread across social media with the timestamp clearly visible, showing a professional woman being forced to the ground while explaining she was trying to catch a flight to see her dying uncle. Lawrence provided the body cam footage showing Holloway's deliberate delays and baseless questions. He released data showing Holloway pulled over black women at rates 6 times higher than their percentage of traffic on I-85. The Georgia State Patrol tried to defend Holloway initially, claiming he'd followed proper procedures for a traffic stop. But the defense collapsed when Lawrence presented their timeline. 43 minutes for a simple speeding ticket, questions about citizenship with no legal basis, a search request without probable cause, an arrest for obstruction when the subject tried to leave after being illegally detained. Captain Raymond Torres, Holloway's supervisor who'd signed off on dismissing previous complaints, was called to explain why the pattern had been ignored. He had no good answer. The disciplinary files showed he'd seen the complaints, recognized similarities, and done nothing except require Holloway to take a brief training course that clearly hadn't changed his behavior. Lawrence stood before cameras and said what departments hated hearing from him. My niece lost time with me that we can never get back. She was arrested for the crime of being a black woman in a nice car trying to catch a flight. And this department knew Officer Holloway was doing this to women for years and allowed it to continue. Derek Holloway was fired from the Georgia State Patrol within 3 weeks of Lawrence Baptiste's press conference, terminated for a pattern of racial profiling that the department could no longer defend or ignore. He lost his law enforcement certification permanently and faced criminal charges for false arrest and deprivation of civil rights. The trial was brief because the Bodycam footage told the entire story, showing deliberate delays and baseless detention. He was convicted and sentenced to 18 months in prison with 3 years probation afterward, prohibited from ever working in law enforcement again. The civil lawsuit resulted in a $2.7 million settlement from the state of Georgia, with additional settlements paid to the 3 other women who'd come forward with similar stories about Holloway's targeting of black women drivers. But Lawrence negotiated for more than just money. The consent decree he forced the department to accept required comprehensive reforms. Mandatory data collection on all traffic stops broken down by race and gender, automatic review of any officer who showed statistical disparities in who they stopped, civilian oversight of profiling complaints, and termination of supervisors who dismissed valid complaints without proper investigation. Captain Raymond Torres was demoted and eventually forced into early retirement when the investigation revealed he'd ignored clear patterns in Holloway's complaint history. 3 other supervisors faced disciplinary action for failing to address racial profiling complaints seriously. But the legal victories couldn't restore what had been taken. Elena finally made it to Chicago 4 days after her original flight, after the arrest was resolved and she could travel without legal complications. Those 4 days were 4 days less with her Uncle Lawrence, 4 days of a summer that was already cruelly short. She spent 6 weeks with him in Chicago, and they were good weeks filled with stories and laughter and the kind of deep conversations you have when time is finite and precious. But the shadow of what happened hung over everything. Lawrence was weaker than he'd wanted to be when she arrived, exhausted from the trip to Atlanta and the stress of the case, even though he'd never admit it. The time they'd lost at the beginning was time when he'd still had more energy, more strength, more of himself to give. Lawrence died 3 months after Elena returned to Atlanta, slipping away on a quiet September morning with family around him. Elena flew back to Chicago for the funeral carrying guilt that she knew was irrational but couldn't shake. Guilt that she'd lost those 4 days at the beginning of summer. Guilt that the officer who detained her had stolen time she could never reclaim. The settlement money sat mostly untouched in her account. She donated a significant portion to organizations fighting police misconduct and racial profiling. The rest felt tainted, payment for suffering that shouldn't have existed, and loss that couldn't be compensated. She tried to return to work but found herself unable to drive on I-85 without panic attacks. The sight of patrol cars in her rearview mirror triggered anxiety so severe she had to pull over and wait for her hands to stop shaking. She eventually started taking alternative routes that added 20 minutes to her commute, just to avoid the stretch of highway where Holloway had stopped her. Her Lexus, the car she'd been so proud of when she bought it, became a source of stress. She found herself wondering if other officers would see her the same way Holloway had, if her professional success and the possessions it afforded her would always be viewed with suspicion because of her race. She traded it in for a more modest sedan, hating herself for making that choice but unable to bear the anxiety of driving a nice car that might attract the wrong attention. The case became a landmark example in police reform discussions, cited in training materials and policy debates about racial profiling. Lawrence's final major case became part of his legacy, taught in law schools as a masterclass in civil rights litigation. Elena spoke at events about her experience when asked, using her story to push for change. But 2 years later, sitting in her apartment looking at photos from that summer in Chicago, what she remembered most wasn't the settlement or the reforms or the officer's conviction. She remembered the 4 days at the beginning that were stolen from her, the days when Lawrence had still been stronger, when summer was just starting and time felt less desperately scarce. She'd won every legal battle. Holloway was in prison. The department changed its policies. Other victims got justice because she'd come forward. But winning didn't restore those lost days with her uncle. didn't erase the trauma of being handcuffed on a highway shoulder, didn't remove the fear that stayed with her every time she got behind the wheel. The reforms were real and necessary. The accountability mattered. But she'd trade all of it. The settlement, the conviction, the policy changes, every victory for those 4 days back, for the chance to have arrived in Chicago when she was supposed to have started that last summer with her uncle without the weight of what Holloway had done hanging over everything. Justice was served and change was achieved, but the time that was stolen stayed stolen, and no amount of legal victories could buy back the moments that mattered most. 4 days doesn't sound like much until it's 4 days. You can't get back with someone you're about to lose forever. Share this if you believe that racial profiling has real costs that settlements can't fix. Hit subscribe on JPTV for more stories where accountability happened, but victims paid prices that justice couldn't restore. Drop a comment. What reforms would actually stop officers from targeting people based on race? Until next time.
Physical evidence and forgotten records do not simply exist in a vacuum. They vividly recount the stories of those who came before us. Finding the objective truth within them is our highest professional duty. Thank you for standing beside us as we carefully unravel these mysteries.